Good afternoon. Question 1. The conception gives a very precise definition of what consciousness is, what will is. Can you define what attention is? In the first part of Fundamentals of Sociology, a definition is given to what attention is, and we will return to this question in the course of the lecture. Question 2. Here is a passage from the Wisdom of Solomon 11:20. But thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight. The question is it about matter, information, and measure? No, this is about different manifestations of measure. First, a generalization is given by measure, then it is specified by number, quantity, weight. Question 3. I had an accident. I understand that this is the language of God for my doings. Is it possible to heal eyesight if doctors say that this is impossible because my nerve broke? Or is this an internal incentive for development and changing views? Then God will help. And what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Yes, I think that it is in both aspects. The language of life circumstances and an incentive in some way to develop further. Now you see, the question of the regenerative potential of the human organism. In some questions, in particular regarding the tail, the lizard's regeneration takes place automatically. Man also has regenerative potential, but it does not work automatically. There are cases of restoration of very badly damaged and lost organs. At least there are publications on this theme. I myself have not seen anything serious, but nevertheless I can tell you that there have been cases of regeneration of the destroyed retina. The retina recovered, not quickly, within a year or two. This required sincere prayer, one's own envisioning on the theme of how the damaged retina is being restored, the belief that it will recover. That is, a way out of the paradoxical state when part of the psyche works towards recovering and the other part of the psyche says, this is impossible because it's not confirmed by medical practice. Well, this also requires patience and perseverance. If God is willing, if you are patient, develop an effective envisioning, the optic nerve will be restored. Everything will be fine. This will hardly be fast, but nevertheless. Question 4. Mikhail Viktorovich. So, if you live according to your Sovest, there is a high probability of pushing up daisies. And if you don't want to, what to do? Lie? Well, here the situation is such that if you live according to your Sovest and act in the stream of providence, then you will not push up daisies earlier than the time appointed by God. This is one side of the question. Yes, and life will certainly not be easy. Yes, you can really push up daisies, but only if the meaning of your life is to learn to live according to your Sovest, but not the way you lived. And upon achieving this result, there is no point in the further dwelling of your soul in this world. In other words, if the task is completed, then there is no point in suffering on. Question. And if you don't want to, what to do? Lie? Every time we lie, we act within the boundaries of God's allowance, and we simply need to be conscious of this and think, for the sake of what do we violate the boundaries of providence and enter the realm of allowance? Next question. Question 5. Man's reason is allowed from above to determine and assign new boundaries of what is possible for himself in creativity. Does this imply ethics that determines these boundaries? No, this is not ethics that determines these boundaries. This refers to the opening of new possibilities for creativity and their implementation. But indeed, nraviousness and ethics, they determine the possibilities of opening and the possibilities of implementation. Because if nraviousness does not allow one to see something, to see some possibilities that objectively exist, then there is nothing further to talk about. I showed the example at the last lecture when I commented on the statement of Nobel laureate in economics, Vasily Leontiev, where he says that the availability to everyone of knowledge and other products is certainly a very good thing, but who will invest in their production if it is impossible to make a profit? In this case, Vasily Leontiev's nraviousness made it impossible for him to see a different mode of functioning of macroeconomic systems, when they really work to satisfy the needs of people and provide guaranteed satisfaction of all life-consistent needs. and as a result, there is no need for restriction via prices of consumption. Yes, such a possibility is open, but this leads to the question: how to organize governance towards the macroeconomic system in the transitional mode from what it is to this mode, upon reaching which the life of society in this mode will be stable. And we will not end up with that which was described in the famous experiment Universe 25 about the consumer paradise for mice, which brought them out of the impact of biological objective laws, and in particular, those objective laws that are expressed in what in biology has the name natural selection. And then, even if you see the possibilities, and your nraviousness and ethics do not allow them to be implemented, then everything turns out according to the Russian proverb, "It would be nice to get to paradise, but many a sin won't let me in." That is, yes, the possibilities are objectively realizable, but your subjective state is not such as to realize them. Therefore, you need to work on yourself in order that possibilities in the stream of providence would open up for you, and that your nraviousness and ethics would allow you to realize these possibilities. Question 6. For what was the term vector of governing impact introduced? Well, what for what? In order to delimit between processes of governance, which in the overwhelming majority of cases are multifactorial processes affecting many things in life, from the environment, from the object of governance, from the system of governance towards the object. This is why the term vector of governing impact was introduced. Look at the picture in the sufficiently general theory of governance, structuring of information in the process of governance, the vector of objectives of governance, the vector of the current state, repeating the structure of the vector of objectives of governance, which includes control parameters, an extended vector of the current state, which includes the vector of governing impact, and free parameters, any values of which, in the process of governance, are recognized as acceptable. That is, without a vector of governing impact, this structure proposed by the sufficiently general theory of governance becomes impossible. Well, how to use the vector of governing impact in practice? You need to know the sufficiently general theory of governance. You need to sense life and meaningfully correlate what you sense with the matrix of setting and solving governorial tasks that is offered by the sufficiently general theory of governance. But in order to use all this, you need to develop in yourself what can be called process thinking. That is, when you see not a sequence of successive states that do not have internal dynamics, but you see how the internal dynamics of each of these states generates transient processes to the next subsequent state, either in linear algorithmics of development or in branching algorithmics of development. And then the question arises before you: how to choose governance so that it will not lead the process along those branches that lead to intermediate and final states that are unacceptable for you. Again, when last year we discussed the problematics of stability in terms of predictability of behavior, that was exactly what we were talking about. Question 7. The Quran relates about the messengers of God: Moses, Jesus Christ, Muhammad. Why is there not a single word about Buddha, as he was a messenger and chronologically followed Moses, carrying out his mission in 600 BC? You see, if Buddhism preserved what Buddha taught, then Buddhism was originally a pantheistic creed. That is, it deifies nature, or completely denies the existence of God. These are two versions. Therefore, if Buddhism corresponds with what was originally given by Buddha, then the Quran does not mention Buddha as a messenger. This is not a statement, this is one of the versions of what could have been, because we do not know the reliable history, and we don't know for sure what the founders of the faiths taught, in what words, and we do not know how adequate the translations into other languages are, since everything was said, firstly, in the languages of the peoples among whom they lived, and secondly, the meaning of many words in those days was somewhat different, and in some cases, directly opposite to what is accepted today. Question 8. Moses did not come out of the desert alive. What happened to him? Was he killed? I can't say anything about this. The only mention in the New Testament is that the devil argued with the archangel Michael about the right to own the body of Moses. Apparently it was supposed that a zombie doll would be made using the body, which would have kept the memory of the life of Moses, but would not have had the will of Moses. And in some way it could have been used in some devilish affairs. But Moses really did not come out of the desert alive. Whether his death was natural, or whether he was killed, I do not know. Well, the body remained and became the subject of a dispute. Question 9. If the soulmate is not a virgin, is she the soulmate? Is it worth getting married to her? But there is also a counter question. And if she is not your first one, then is it even worth a virgin marrying you? Because egregorially you continue to be connected with all your past women, and to some extent, through the biofield component of the genetic mechanism, it will impact your children. This is really a fact that science, which thinks only in substantial categories, avoiding the study of the biofield component, physiology, the work of the human genetic mechanism, will say that all this is nonsense. But nonetheless, this is not nonsense. Non-virginity in marriage for both men and women, it in some way impacts their children. Nonetheless, I will say it again, there are no people without a past, but there are people without a future. The past, it is what it is. But if we change views on it praviously, then our erroneous and malicious behavioral programs of the past cease to dominate over our descendants. We do not pass these programs on to them as their spiritual heritage, which, under certain conditions, with their senseless and will-less behavior, can automatically be realized in their lives. Therefore, the question is posed one-sidedly, and the one-sidedness of the question does not imply the possibility of a life-consistent, correct answer. Question 10. Therefore, when, further there is a link, Ivan Antonovich Yefremov in the novel Razor's Edge called men who refuse to create a family with women only because they are not virgins, fanatics, is he right? Yes, he is partly right, but once again, there are no people without a past. This applies to both men and women. But there are people without a future. This also applies to both men and women. And therefore the past can be accepted as it is, both your past and someone else's past. But you have to make sure that this past will not backfire in the future, either in your life or in the life of your descendants. There was such a singer, the last in essence Russian singer, Valentina Vasilievna Толкунова. Listen, feel through what is situationally behind the words of the songs performed by her. Trouble has green eyes. Where have you been before? If there were no war. Question 11. Answering the question about DNA genealogy, you mentioned in particular one or two tribes that look like people in appearance, but do not give offspring as a result of interbreeding with other people. Can you tell me what kind of tribes they are, and where can I learn more about this phenomenon? If possible, provide links to the sources for self-study. You see, I just noticed this theme when it came into my view. The links were not remembered. Google it, study ethnography, biology. I think that finding this information will not be difficult. Question 12. I would like to know more about statistics. Two humped ones, for example. How to use them correctly, to work with them. Ideally in practice, to use them to analyze everyday situations in governance. What do you know about the science of pedology? Pedology is one theme, and everything related to statistics is a different theme. First of all, if you use it at a professional level, you need to know mathematical analysis, because the whole probability theory and mathematical statistics is, first of all, a specific application of the apparatus of mathematical analysis. Second, you need to understand what metrological consistency is in general and how it is expressed in life. Because the application of any mathematical apparatus to solving practical tasks is, first of all, questions of metrological consistency, because if they are not solved, you are doomed at some stage to add up apples with liters of water. You will not have stewed juice in the end. There will be stupidity. Well then, how to work with this in practice? Yes, there is a plurality. A plurality is described by statistics, provided that their metrological consistency is ensured. Changes in pluralities, the dynamics of their development and degradation, are expressed in changes of statistics. Statistics must be correlated with the matrix of setting and solving governorial tasks, which is proposed by the sufficiently general theory of governance. It is needed to find a place for them. The apparatus of probability theory and mathematical statistics makes it possible to reveal the interdependence of statistics in life. Accordingly, it is possible to build a governing impact and rely on the apparatus of probability theory and mathematical statistics in the practice of governance. But if this is all difficult, it is truly difficult, because mastering mathematical analysis and probability theory, well, at the pace of our ordinary life, in the background of everyday things, work, takes about a year or two in order for you to understand what it is and how it is mutually connected and connected with life. Well, if at least you want to get views about what statistics are, watch the lecture, 12 Questions for Officials and Other Governors. There you can come across the most simple views, get images about what the theory of probability and statistics is. At the end of the 1960s in the USSR, the book Mathematics in the Modern World was published. This is a collection of articles written in the American science magazine, Scientific America. This is their analog of our science magazine, Science and Life. And these articles were written on various issues of mathematics by the leading American mathematicians of that time. The book is written in such a way that an ordinary person who has not taken a course in higher mathematics at university would anyway understand what mathematics is, how one or another of its branches are internally arranged, and how to use it in practice. This is a useful book. Question 13. How, from the position of the sufficiently general theory of governance, the theory of intellect, should one relate to the development of memory as a component of one's own psyche? Well, first of all, once again, the model of intellect, which is presented in expanded versions in the sufficiently general theory of governance, is not at all a theory of intellect. Its task is completely different. To show that it is possible, on the basis of inherently intellectless elements, to build a system, the work of which will be perceived as a manifestation of intellectual activity. And it is possible to build such a system only on the condition that information and measure are recognized as objective categories of the being of the universe. If we recognize information and measure as something subjective, then all theories of intellect fall apart due to their inadequacy, because intellect is indeed a pan-natural phenomenon, subordinated to certain objective laws that need to be cognized. Question 14. What do you know about the science of pedology? Pedology is understood as the science of how a child develops on the way to adulthood. This science is really necessary. It should include certain knowledge in biology, medicine, psychology. What took shape in the historical past could not be correct for the same reason. Information and algorithmics in the science of the past were not perceived as objective categories of being. But since they were not perceived as objective categories of being, then the description of the genetic program for the development of the human organism, the development of the personal psyche, the description of disorders in the operating of genetic programs of development, the description of disorders in the genetic programs themselves, and the consequences that are caused in life by these disorders, they, in the past, could not be adequately described. Therefore, there exist rudiments. Some things were described correctly and retain the practical importance to this day, and will continue to retain. Something needs clarifications and descriptions in a different terminology, because without this it would be impossible to connect it with encompassing processes. Well, some things are just inventions and fictions. Question 15. How to consider the concept of emotional intelligence, which has become fashionable in Western business literature, from the standpoint of the theory of intellect in the sufficiently general theory of governance? Well, how? Everything concerning the so-called emotional intelligence comes from how a person understands what emotions are. And when a person hears about emotional intelligence, he will see behind this term only what corresponds to his own views on emotions. If we turn to the psychological literature, then there exists no theory of emotions in our understanding. If it does not exist, again, for the reasons that information and algorithmics are not perceived by psychological science as objective categories of being. Question 16. How to change a vicious nravious standard to a pravious one? Methods for working with nraviousness. Well, in fact, the answer has been given by one of the commentators. Finding mistakes and correcting them is the hardest work on oneself. A mistake in Greek is a sin, a flaw, an error. But for some reason, sins are forgiven and not corrected. Indeed, if you understand that something in your past activity was unpravious, then consciously comprehending this is not enough, because in order for this not to happen again, you must get to the bottom of the nravious reasons that led you to a wrong, unpravious decision, to an unpravious choice of the path, to unpravious actions on this path. And so if you get to the bottom of these nravious standards of yours, you will consciously comprehend them. And since nraviousness is the same for the level of consciousness and for the unconscious levels, then changing this nravious standard from the level of consciousness and imposing a ban on the use of it will automatically solve the problem. There will remain, however, another problem. You see, there is a saying, you sow a thought, you reap an action, and thought is always nraviously conditioned. You sow an action, you reap a habit. You sow a habit, you reap a character. You sow a character, you reap a destiny. This saying is about the fact that the consequences of one mistake, they tend to grow like an avalanche. And even if you got to the bottom of nravious standards that are wrong and changed them, then you should concern yourself with the fact that all behavioral programs generated by these nravious standards, when they begin to be activated under the impact of external or internal circumstances, revealed, identified by you as unpravious programs, you could, in this case, by your will, block their manifestations, or in some way modify them, in order that they would be pravious and would be in the stream of providence. By the way, this is one of the issues of smoking and other at least not severe drug addictions, because indeed, many psychotropics, getting into the physiology and biochemistry of the human organism, cause dependence on them. Biochemical dependence on them is removed easily and simply, by sincere prayer. And I emphasize, there are two words here, sincere and prayer. A ritual prayer is not sincere. It does not guarantee anything. It is false. But a sincere prayer is not false, and it guarantees the answer of the Almighty according to your faith, that this dependence will be gone. What remains? And there remain a lot of situation stimuli, in which unconscious automatisms orient you towards lighting a cigarette, drinking a glass of some strong drink and something else. So all such programs should be revealed, and in situation stimuli, when they manifest themselves, by one's own will, one should say, stop, do not follow this. But if there is no meaningful will, then, in situation stimuli, there will be a breakdown. This applies to the thing that happens in processes called coding against addictions. There remains the question of the development of memory. I was distracted by the theme of emotional intelligence, but nonetheless, the question of development of memory remains. You see, memory is a component of the psyche. Moreover, it is really focused on the unconscious levels of the psyche. And if a person is not crippled, that is, his nervous system is structurally healthy, anatomically healthy, then the memory works automatically, and the unconscious levels of the psyche remember everything that happens to him with such detailedness that one can't even imagine in the ordinary state of everyday life. One of the problems of the overwhelming majority of people is not non-development of memory. This is an incorrect formulation. It is the inaccessibility of memory. If memory is inaccessible, then the imitation of memory is started by the play of imagination. The play of imagination creates a certain image of the past, which has very little in common and perhaps has nothing in common at all with the events that really took place in the past. Therefore, it's necessary not to develop memory, but to master the skill, which is called in Russian to relive again. You can relive involuntarily, under pressure, under the impact of some circumstances. At your level of consciousness, the entire flow of feelings that took place in the past in some situation will emerge more or less brightly, and you will see everything that was in the past with a tape cinematic accuracy, and you will be able to describe it in words at present. The skill must be mastered. Our culture, unfortunately, is such that in childhood we don't master it. Culture suppresses it. One of the factors of suppression is fear, because it is common for a person to forget all sorts of unpleasant things and avoid remembering them. Well, we have to remove this block, characteristic feature of our memory, of our psyche, a feature not of our memory, but a feature of the algorithmics for accessing the memory. And if you can remove them, then by your will, you just name the date, it will cause a film, a newsreel of what was happening at that time. Yes, there can be external keys to access certain things. In the old days, the diaries of Nikolai II were published. The commenters drew attention to the fact that the Tsar wrote, "I walked there, killed such a number of crows, and something else like that." There were comments of the type, "What a moron, he counted crows." So one of the versions of our history is that Tsar Alexei Nikolaevich was not killed. He survived and lived a long life under the name of Vasily Xenofonovich Filatov. He told his son, Oleg Vasilievich Filatov, about his childhood, and among other things, there was an episode when he was walking with his father. He asked him, "How many crows have flown by?" The child could not answer. Nikolai explained to him that one should pay attention to such trifles. Now let's look at the situation from the position of the Tsar. He lives in a palace. There are many documents that contain a state secret or a family secret, which in fact is also a state secret under monarchy. There are no guarantees that these documents will not become the property of someone else. Well, a valet, for example, can read and retell the content to someone. This was even in an era when there was no photography. Copies, making copies, was out of the question, because all that took time. Encryption? Well, ultimately, this is a question for decryptors. In fact, the vast majority of encryptions are breakable, and the question arises, how to save information to which there should be no unauthorized third-party access? Such a diary, a chronological key, is one of the ways to activate the process of reliving. Everything works. On the one hand, it's simple, but on the other hand, it is difficult. We open our diary and read some descriptions related to a certain date. If the skill to relive is not suppressed, then the entire movie of these events that took place in the past opens up before the inner gaze, the inner hearing. The only question is sensitivity, because if there was something unpleasant, such as injuries, wounds, burns, and reliving occurs at high energies, then all these injuries and burns can be reproduced from memory without any external factors of impact. This, by the way, refers to the question of regeneration of lost or damaged organs. In the past, they were holistic, and if the memory concerning their holism is activated at sufficiently high energies in terms of power, then the corresponding processes will occur in the organism, and regeneration will become possible. But again, this is a required skill, but not a biological automatism which is characteristic of the biological species Homo sapiens. Well, and those people who are not familiar with such a practice as accessing their own memory through a certain chronological diary, they read the diaries of Nikolai II and see records about crows, cats, some absurd events, and the answer is clear to them. The Tsar was an idiot. Nikolai II was not such an idiot, but unfortunately, he was not brought up in such a way that in the critical conditions that fell on his reign, Russia under his governance could have avoided a social catastrophe. But that is a different theme. There are memoirs of his colleague, Kaiser Wilhelm. There is a phrase which approximately goes like this. From the point of view of Nikolai II, the one who was last to leave his office was right. And further he continues, I could not be the last person to leave his office in all cases when it was necessary. How much such a characterization of Nikolai II by Kaiser is justified is a subject for a thoughtful historical analysis, because those who hold the position that Nikolai II is a holy Tsar great martyr will never agree with such an evaluation. But the actual history of his reign, the origin of the Russian-Japanese War, the origin of the First World War, they bring us to the idea that as a sovereign governor, he did not correspond to his position in those historical circumstances. And in fact, we must thank God for the fact that the Bolsheviks, after the liberal bourgeois revolution, were able to pull the country out of the crisis, lead it to victory in the Great Patriotic War, and thereby create a potential of development for the future, which turned out to be so great that they failed to pull it down during the years of the Khrushchev thaw, during the years of Brezhnev's stagnation, during the years of perestroika and the so-called democratic reforms of the 1990s. So we have finished with the questions. Now let's move on to the theme of today's lecture. It so happened that in the previous lecture, we did not get to the end of the theme. A number of questions remained unconsidered for the simple reason that if everything was put into the format of one lecture, then many things would not be clear. And with a detailed presentation, more than one lecture is required. Therefore, I recommend that you stop at this place, watch the previous lecture again after finishing the answers to the previous questions, and after you've watched that lecture, start watching today's video from this moment. And those who for some reason do not want to do this, I'll remind you about the summary of the previous lecture. The personal psyche is an informational algorithmic system. It is two-leveled. The first level is consciousness. Consciousness is the realm of informational algorithmic identification of the eternal soul of man and creation, into which the soul is sent by the Almighty to fulfill a certain mission, and the unconscious levels of the psyche, in which our memory and intellectual power are concentrated, to which many biofield senses are enclosed, to which communication channels with biologically and socially conditioned egregors and everything else are enclosed. The performance speed of our consciousness is 15 bits per second, no more. That is, we can distinguish no more than 15 different states within a second, and consciously control not more than 7, a maximum of 12, depending on fatigue and other factors, objects at the same time. The factor that unites consciousness and the unconscious levels of the psyche is our nraviousness. Nraviousness is functionally similar to a set of conditional jump operators in algorithms. Every nravious standard is a certain situation connected with a certain condition. If the condition is met, one branch of the algorithm operates. If the condition is not met, another branch of the algorithm operates. Therefore, while a person's nraviousness is what it is, many questions for him are closed, since information flows cannot be perceived or cannot be correctly, meaningfully comprehended. Further on, we talked about the schemes for processing information by our psyche. There were 3 of them. The first is the flow of feelings, senses. The information brought by the senses directly transforms into our behavior. At the same time, one circumstance remained in the defaults. That since this is the scheme of governance with the highest performance speed, the most primitive, it carries in its functioning a compilational character. It juxtaposes with the incoming flow of information those behavioral programs that already exist, or some combination of behavioral programs that are already in the psyche. And on account of ready solutions, it gives out a certain governorial decision that is implemented in our behavior. But the noise immunity of this scheme is minimal, practically none, because everything is determined by 2 factors: incoming information, a set of behavioral programs in memory, and behavior as such, based on juxtaposing one with the other. The second scheme of information processing is more complicated. The flow of incoming information is loaded into the memory, occupies some place there, and on the basis of the entire worldview that has taken shape in the person by this time, in some way a governorial decision is worked out, which is implemented in behavior. The performance speed is slower, because decisions, behavioral programs which were not previously available in the memory, in a ready-to-use form, can be generated. The immunity to external manipulation of this scheme is higher than that of the first, because you can manipulate the incoming flow of information, but modifying the memory of the object of manipulation, this is a separate theme that requires some effort, time, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, unreliable information in the memory can accumulate, and over time, become an information basis for the working out of incorrect governorial decisions. The third scheme of governance. Everything is the same, only the information is loaded into the memory through the quarantine. The information that the algorithm sentinel cannot evaluate as reliable is loaded into the quarantine, and then for some time it is verified. And if it's recognized as reliable, then it becomes the basis for the working out of governorial decisions in the future. And if it's recognized as unreliable, then it's taken into account as a factor in the working out of governorial decisions, which must be avoided and evaded. At the same time, the algorithm sentinel, which carries out the incoming control of information in the flows, can also be improved, thereby increasing the reliability and stability of the psyche. This scheme of information processing is the slowest, but it is the most reliable. It is the normal scheme for the work of our psyche in all life circumstances. Well, maybe with the exception of when we are on vacation and are engaged in self-digging in our own psyche and changing views on our own beloved selves. There may be some specificity when we re-evaluate what was previously evaluated as correct, assuming that it is incorrect, and vice versa. We can supplement the information that we have with some kind of fiction, and we can simulate situations that did not happen or that are impossible, and a lot of other things. But that's another theme. The processes of interaction with the environment, they are such that the normal scheme of governance is the third, through verification and quarantine of all incoming flows of information, and the working out of governorial decisions on the basis of what is recognized as reliable information. The next scheme is without verification. It has a higher performance speed, but also a lower noise immunity. And the first scheme, when everything is built on the basis of the incoming flow of information, has the highest performance speed. But these are critical situations when any governorial decision is better than a complete absence of governorial decisions or a delay in the correct governorial decision. You know, there is a medical anecdote on the theme of delaying. The therapist thinks he knows, but he can't do anything. The surgeon knows little, but can do a lot. The autopsist knows everything and can do everything, but it's too late. The first scheme of governance is to protect one against those situations when it's too late. The question on emotional intelligence arose. The answer to the question about emotional intelligence, it is a consequence of the answer to the question, what are emotions? We examined the psyche as a two-level informational algorithmic system. It was determined that in an ordinary state, the performance speed is 15 bits per second, 7 to 9 objects at the same time, a maximum of 12. But life is much more complicated than 15 bits per second and 12 objects at the same time. There is a lot of information, and in order for the psyche to work correctly, in order for man to behave in life in a correctly safe way for himself, these 15 bits per second and a maximum of 12 objects at the same time may not be enough. More information is required, higher performance speed is required. And then the questions arise. What to do with this in such a situation? Here are two answers. The first variant. We master some kind of yogic practice, as a result of which our consciousness shifts to a different frequency range, and in relation to our time, we no longer perceive 15 bits per second, but terabytes of information per second. Yes, this is possible, but in everyday life we usually live in a different mode. Some emotional background is added to our 15 bits per second. And now if you understand that man's psyche is an informational algorithmic system, then emotions are simply densely packed information that can be unpacked at the level of consciousness and realized as certain factology, as certain processes, as certain algorithmics related to these processes and factology. And along with these 15 bits per second, we are conscious of our emotional background. We can draw a technical analogy. You're designing a control panel for an operator to work on. The system that he has to govern is described by a very large number of parameters, but since the vector of objectives of governance is a certain hierarchy, you put the most significant control parameters on the display or on the screen of this control panel. But since there are many control parameters, the question arises, what to do with the rest of the control parameters? If you put them on the screen, then the operator can simply get confused when reading information from all these parameters and lose governance in a critical situation. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question. If the process of governance flows more or less normally, then the operator does not need to see the entire vector of control parameters. He can track only a small number of the most significant parameters. But if the rest of the parameters that were not included in the list of the most significant ones somehow start to behave differently, then what to do? And then you can add a light bulb to those parameters on the control panel. If everything is normal, the light is green. And if something is not normal, but within permissibly acceptable range, the light turns yellow. Well, this is how the check engine light works in modern cars. The car is moving anyway, and from the driver's point of view, the engine seems to be working normally. The dynamics are normal. But nonetheless, the check engine light is on. If the control system is in good working condition, then the fact that the check engine light is on means that you need to go to a service station and let them diagnose the car in order to identify the factor that causes the check engine light to come on. If some parameters deviate from the norm and go beyond the acceptable range, then the light should turn red. And if there is a sound signal that will attract the operator's attention, then we will get a functional analog of emotions in the form of this light on the control panel. We are conscious of everything that is normal, everything that matters most. But if we feel heavy-hearted, then it's necessary to understand why we feel heavy-hearted, why the emotions are not correct. And then, in this case we are faced with the question, what emotions are correct? If the psyche is one whole, if it is holistic, then this is the question. What emotions have to correspond to what kind of comprehended meaning in order for the psyche to function correctly? In the traditions of Western psychology, this question does not even arise, to say nothing of it being discussed. In Buddhism, this question is touched upon. Yes, there are a number of provisions that one should control emotions, one should keep up a certain emotional mood, and then everything will be more or less fine. In the Christian tradition, there is also a provision that discouragement is a sin. Well, in fact, nothing is said about when positive emotions, so-called positive emotions, go off scale, and a person goes crazy with euphoria. That is, there really is a question, but there is no answer to it in the atheistic world understanding. In the religious world understanding, the answer to this question stems from the assertion that the Almighty is infallible, and everything that happens in life happens in the best possible way according to those nravs and ethics which are inherent to people. If this meaning is clear and is recognized as adequate to the life situation and life in general, then the following answer is natural. The realization of this meaning should be accompanied by extremely bright emotions. Yes, they should not go off scale. That is, the energy on which they go should not be such that a person goes crazy, becomes overexcited, and he does who knows what, emotionally expressing himself. It is a quiet, serene joy. The joy that the sun is shining, the rain is falling, or there is snow, frost. Joy even about the fact that someone is doing something wrong, because on the one hand, if someone does something wrong, it's a kind of villainy. But on the other hand, in fact, if this villainy is being done, then some psychodynamic vices of society are expressed, behind which there are vices of certain raviousness of the society. Therefore, without whitewashing Hitler and those like him, we must nonetheless recognize that they did one good deed. If someone in the 1920s had described all the atrocities of the Third Reich, he would have been considered a crazy idiot, because from the point of view of a cultured person of that era, such atrocities were impossible for a civilized, cultured European. But they were realized. Why? Because there was a nravious readiness for these atrocities in the psychodynamics of European society. It had potential. Hitler and Hitlerists, they exposed this potential by their actions, realized it. And in fact, despite these atrocities, this circumstance opened up opportunities, or became a motivating factor for people to ponder about where it all came from. Can it happen again in the future? And the practice of the American war in Vietnam, and what the NATO members did in Yugoslavia, what ISIS are doing in Syria, shows that they pondered badly and did not draw proper conclusions. But nonetheless, the conscious comprehension of the principle, the Almighty is infallible, and everything that happens in life happens in the best possible way according to those nravs and ethics which are inherent to people. This should evoke bright emotions even in the most cruel, unpravious situations, because only with this emotion, meaning, mood tuning will your psyche as an informational algorithmic system correctly perceive information, process it correctly, and even if you have balls and chains because of villains, and it seems like you cannot do anything, but taking into account that the soul is eternal, then you will be able to make a certain contribution to the psychodynamics of society, humanity, which will be blago in relation to the future. Therefore, the saying that there are no situations with no ways out, it has not only the meaning that no ways out situations are situations, the way out of which is unacceptable for you, with the conscious comprehension of the thought that the Almighty is infallible. Any way out of any situation, with the exception of nraviously vicious, Sovestless ones, is an acceptable way out, even if the functioning of your organism stops. Yes, it stops, maybe not that quietly and comfortably for you, but nonetheless, if it stops, you have fulfilled your life mission, on condition that you lived according to your Sovest. Until now, we have been talking about the structure of the psyche as an informational algorithmic system, mostly touching upon the work of the algorithmics of the psyche, but not its information content. Now let's turn mainly to the informational aspect of our psychic activity. Last time I said that the main task of the worldview is to model the course of events at a pace that is ahead of the real course of events in life. Well, let's say that we are building an airplane. What happens before we roll the first model out of the assembly shop to the airfield? We model the future behavior of this airplane. The first stage of modeling is the intention of the chief designer. He envisions this plane at all stages of its life cycle, if he is a smart designer. At all stages of the life cycle, this means that all design work, technological support for the production of the prototype, and the provision of mass production, all this, somewhere in the depths of his psyche, appears as a process. Then it goes out into the outside world. Design construction documentation appears. The design construction documentation is repeatedly redone until the first model appears. Some variants are eliminated, other variants are refined. New variants are created in an effort to integrate the qualities of some rejected variants into them. As a result, the first model appears. It flies. Claims are made against this model. Modeling goes on again, not in thought, however, but object modeling, a materialized one. And as a result, a real plane appears. So, if all the modeling was effective, correct, then it turns out to be a masterpiece of engineering thought. It flies. Accident rate statistics are low, the pilots are happy, it is comfortable, good, they do not feel tired, passengers are happy, the flight is like a rest but not fatigue. Ground services are also happy because everything is easily maintained and the plane is reliable and safe. If the modeling in the early stages did not go as it should have gone, then as a result there appears something with an extremely high accident rate, extremely inconvenient statistics of errors during maintenance, the pilots are not happy and do not want to fly, ground services are not happy because servicing a plane of this type is self-violation and a feat. And at the basis, after all, lies the worldview, as a model of the world, which is intended for the fact that we model multivariate flows of events at a pace that is proactive in relation to the real flows of events. And this function of the worldview applies to all branches of activity, from small everyday problems, housekeeping, to such large-scale socio-economic phenomena that stand behind the saying, "If you want peace, prepare for war." Therefore, the question arises, what is a worldview? In the conception of social safety, a worldview is all images, all melodies, moving and static, which are in our psyche at a certain moment of time, t. This is a picture of the world, a living picture of the world, which is mobile. And now, due to the fact that it's mobile, it's possible to model at a pace that is ahead of the real course of events. Moreover, pay attention. The worldview is not connected with language, with any language. It is not connected with our articulate speech, with any other languages, symbolic, not symbolic. Mathematics is not only a science, it is also a language for describing the world. Well, and then the question arises about the relationship between language and worldview. A concept is a determination of the interconnection of a certain image and lexicon. Accordingly, the world understanding is a set of all images and lexical means connected with each of these images, and these connections are dynamic, and moreover, in both directions. Well, let's take a look. I pronounced the word tender. What is behind this word? There are different variants. In modern conditions, this is mostly understood as an offer for the purpose of choosing a certain contractor for a certain work. This is a tender. In the era of steam locomotives, a tender was a rail car coupled to a steam locomotive to carry fuel and water, thanks to which the steam locomotive actually moved. In addition, tender, allegorically in the terminology of the Russian railway workers of that era, meant hindquarters. Now look in the opposite direction. We have an object called tender, and it's a rail car coupled to a steam locomotive. We can call it a tender, we can call it a trailer. We don't like this word, we can call it something else. We can make up some other word. Whether it will take root or not is another question. And if we talk about the world understanding, then it's always subjective, because this interconnection between images and lexicon, it is established subjectively. But along with this, in society, there are statistics that show or that can be identified, and in this case, it will show how people connect certain images with certain words. And thanks to the fact that such statistics exist, and there is a certain uniform understanding of the same words, our articulate speech is a means of communicating between people. If we talk about language as a means of communication, then we must immediately admit that this is not a very effective means of communication, because I've been talking for quite a while, but if you could perceive the imaged picture that is supported in my psyche during this hour, then you would not need to watch this video. You would perceive everything much faster and you could do something else. That is, the performance speed of a speech channel or a textual written channel as a means of transmitting information leaves much to be desired. The second question is related to the fact that unambiguous understanding of words is not guaranteed. It is not guaranteed mainly by the fact that there is a contextually conditioned meaning when the same word, depending on the circumstances in which it's pronounced or perceived, denotes slightly different phenomena for a person. Circumstances change, the meaning of the words changes. That is, language as articulate speech, as a means of transferring information from one subject to another, is not the most effective means, and there is reason to believe that it should serve to solve other tasks. The conception of social safety assumes that the main purpose of articulate speech is to govern the flow of life events in a matrix egregorial way. That is, when you abide in the right mood tuning, everything happens in the mode, as it was said, so it will be. And therefore, in fact, in all cultures there is a struggle for the last word in the discussion, because the last word in the discussion is a kind of end operator in the program in which it is completed. Well, then the questions arise, what types of worldview and world understanding can there be? Because depending on what type they are, your ability to model the flow of events will be that effective. If we stay within the framework of the conception of social safety, then there can be two types of worldview and world understanding, large types. Worldview and world understanding based on the categories space and time as empty receptacles of matter and spirit, or the space-time continuum as receptacles of matter, which can be either in the form of substance or in the field form, but the essence does not change because of synonymous wording. Space, time, matter in the form of substance and in the form of fields, or like in Scientology, MEST, matter, energy that is the same matter but in some transitional processes, space and time. Everything is the same, unchanged, since the days of ancient Egypt. There is no information and algorithmics here as objective categories. The worldview of the tri-unity of matter, information, measure. Matter is that which exists and interacts with each other, exists in different states of aggregation and transition processes, from one stable state of aggregation to others, and is the carrier of measure. Measure is a numerical determination, quantitative and ordinal. That is, quantity is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and order is the first, the second, the third, and so on. In a broader sense, order is certain interconnections that lead to the fact that matter, the tri-unity of matters, generates space and time as its attributes, intrinsic characteristics, but not as a receptacle of matter. Measure is a matrix of possible states in relation to matter, and in relation to information, the same measure is a system for coding information. In the world in which we live, and of which our organisms are a part, matter does not exist without the two other components, and either of the other two components does not exist apart from matter and the supplementary component. In our understanding, an adequate worldview and world understanding is the world understanding of the tri-unity of matter, information, measure. The next question is related to how primary information arises in the psyche. This question has already been posed many times. In the Quran, there is a surah, chapter 25, which is called Al-Furqan. It is translated as distinction. Well, let's say you have a radio receiver, you turn the tuning knob, and you hear only noises. Why? There are two variants. Either there is no signal, or the signal is indistinguishable from the background. In other words, in order for something distinguishable from the noise to appear, it is required to single out the signal carrying information in the background. The Quran directly says that distinction is given to each person directly by God, depending on the person's nraviousness. As a result of epiphany by distinction, the world breaks up into two components of human perception: something and background. This something turns up against the background of something that we perceive. The border between the background and this something connects this something and the background, because the borders on the one hand are a part of the background, and on the other hand are a part of this something. And then comes the work of the intellect, because in our worldview, this something, given in distinction, it must be meaningfully comprehended. Meaningfully comprehended. This means that an image of this something should take shape. The interconnections of this something with all other images that are in our psyche should be established, determined, set. Thanks to this, models of cause-effect relationships of our world arise in our worldview, and this worldview can be called mosaic. Why? Because if there is something, then it's a kind of detail, like in a mosaic. If you need higher detailedness, you extract a fragment from the mosaic and fill it with new details at a higher resolution, but the overall picture remains the same. The other variant. There are many things in the worldview, and all this is scattered, not interconnected with each other. This is a kaleidoscopic worldview. It corresponds to a kaleidoscopic world understanding. In this regard, there is a proverb. In the garden there are elderberries, but in Kiev there is an uncle. In fact, there is no cause-effect relationship between the elderberries and the uncle. But the proverb can lead to the question, what is the name of the uncle? Maybe the answer is Vasil. Why Vasil? Because in Ukraine there is a proverb, Vasily to his wife is an aunt. This is a total rupture of cause-effect relationships. When everything happens by itself, and a worldview of such a kaleidoscopic type is a very bad model of the world. It cannot model the flow of events properly, and it generates a lot of errors. What is a kaleidoscope? Older age groups should remember from their childhood that there was such a toy pipe. On the one side, there is a peephole into which you look. On the other side, there is frosted glass. Between the frosted glass and the next transparent glass, there is a space where colored glass is placed. And in this toy pipe of the kaleidoscope, there are 3 mirrors formed into an isosceles triangle of mirrors. That is, it is in cross-section. This is such a triangle. And in the inner edges of this mirror, we can see, when we look through the peephole of the kaleidoscope, we see some patterns, reflections of those glass pieces that spin around in the kaleidoscope. There are many patterns. In general, they are practically unrepeatable. The theoretical probability of repetition of any one pattern in the future is minimal. Practical use of the kaleidoscope. In the past, there were publications on the theme that in some cases are drawing for cloth. Well, how do they do it? They rotated colored glass in the kaleidoscope, then looked at what pattern there was, photographed it, drew it, and got a draft drawing for cloth. It was effective since the designer did not have to make up a drawing himself. Well, this is, in fact, probably the only benefit, besides the entertainment of children, from the kaleidoscope. But the mosaic worldview really enables you to model the course of events, predict the course of events, and choose variants. But a situation may arise that a person has everything related to his professional activity, everyday activities. Well, it is more or less mosaic. But these narrowly specialized mosaics spin around in a large kaleidoscope with a plurality of all sorts of scattered facts that are known to man. So if a person has such a worldview, that there are narrowly specialized mosaics, then outside of these mosaics, he is a well-informed idiot, because he can't connect single facts with each other, and can't see the processes in which these facts play one role or the other. If we talk about mosaics, then mosaics are effective depending on how detailed they are. Once again, on the theme of cultural drinking. Every time you drink alcohol, you destroy the detailedness of your mosaic. You erase some colors, make them faded, break some fragments out of it, and thus you reduce its functionality in the task of modeling the flow of processes, and accordingly some types of activity become either inaccessible or dangerous for you and those around you, simply due to the fact that you are not able to predict and implement the desired possible result. Or, due to the errors of prognosis, you are eager to achieve an obviously unrealizable result. But mosaics are also of two types. There is an aphorism ascribed to Newton. If I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants. In a chronological sense, this is indeed correct. Past advances in science are the basis for new and future advances. Due to this, the horizons expand, the visibility becomes further. But this aphorism also expresses what in Russian is characterized by the words, "From my bell tower, it is seen like this." Someone else's bell tower may be higher, and from it, one may see further, and moreover, the same thing can be seen from a different angle, and something can be seen that is not seen from the other bell tower, even within the visibility of each of them. Well, what is beyond the limits of visibility? Beyond the limits, there is the uncognized. There is something that we don't perceive. And there are many factors that also impact our life, which we in some way must also take into account. And it turns out that our worldview and world understanding, it takes shape in the process of our personal development in childhood, in a natural way, in a coordinate system, the center of which is our organism. All sense organs are here, they belong to the organism, and we perceive the world from the standpoint of the coordinate system of our organism. Well, if we move in this triunity of matter-information measure to another point, then the perception changes. And if the perception changes, then the current model of the world may change in some way and become inadequate. Moreover, there is something beyond the limits of our perception, and we in practical need may have to know what is there precisely in order to model the course of events. Well, if there is no reliable information, then it's supplemented by fiction. Fiction may be adequate, but that's another theme, or it may be inadequate. Then we behave approximately like Volker in one of the Soviet movies, where he, on the exam in geography, says that in the north, India borders on an unknown country where only bald people live. From this I-centric worldview stem the following things: the geocentric solar system, where the sun, as one of the planets, spins around the earth, which is the center of creation, and around the solar system there is a sphere of fixed stars. Well, and from this comes the revival of an even more primitive level, the theory of flat earthers that have become more active in the last decade. This is all a consequence of the fact that for us, in personal development, the formation of an I-centric worldview and world understanding is natural, when we perceive space and time as receptacles of matter. Moreover, the division of matter into matter and spirit, it stems from the characteristics of our sense organs. What we feel and see is substance, and what we do not feel or see is spirit. Yes, we can build a mosaic around the I-centrism, but the problems of this mosaic, as I said, they consist in the fact that the change in the coordinates of our own coordinate system, the origin of coordinates, creeping to another point in the triunity, it completely makes our picture of the world not fully adequate. Then the question about an alternative mosaic arises. The mosaic picture of the world can be assembled in different ways, since it is a process. You can go in the direction from your own beloved self to the borders of creation. You will reach the limits of your perception, and then you will begin to fill it with fiction. You can go differently. You can go in the reverse order. God is the Creator and Almighty in relation to this creation. This is the creation of the triunity of matter, information, and measure. We are a part of this creation. Information and algorithmics are objective. Our psyche is an informational algorithmic system. Its information content flows in the mode of distinction, attention, picking up what is given by distinction, meaningful comprehension of what is given in distinction. As a result, the data in distinction are integrated into our world understanding and take some place there. Further, the juxtaposition of the flow of events in which we live with our model of the world and the working out of a behavioral decision, which, according to the principle, practices the criterion of truth, either confirms the consistency of our model or does not confirm it and requires its change. There is something in this model that we really know with certainty. There is something that for some reason is hypothetical, conjectural for us. In some situations, we perceive this as the truth. In some situations, we avoid accepting this as truth and treat it with caution, as a conjecture. And there is the unknown. Well, and the relation towards the unknown is such that if you live in harmony with God, in the stream of providence, then what you know, what you perceive, is within your competence. And what you do not know, what you don't perceive, this is within the competence of the Almighty. He is aware of what is happening. He is not non-participatory. His providence is blago. And if you are not in conflict with him, then everything will be fine. The question about what attention is was asked before the start of the lecture. Attention always works from the level of consciousness. Attention can be of two kinds. If we draw technical analogies, then dispersed attention is when we perceive all the surrounding reality without detailedness, and in fact are not focused on anything. Attention simply scans the horizon, the upper hemisphere, the lower hemisphere, and so on, without clinging onto anything. But if we are waiting for something expected or unknown, not understandable, then this dispersed attention should pick up what is given to us in distinction, or what has analogues in our worldview, world understanding. These are the functions of dispersed attention. What to do with what is being picked up is another question, conditioned by the concretics of the situation and how we are going to relate to it, what line of behavior we are building. Focused attention. Focused attention is functionally analogous to a spotlight or radar that accompanies a target. So, if dispersed attention is like a circular view radar, that is, it simply scans the situation, then the radar, which provides tracking of the target, really receives information from the circular view radar, it is aimed at the target, then it reads the parameters and tracks this target. This is our attention. It is too functional. Dispersed attention is looking for something new or something unknown. Focused attention ensures our activity accompanies an object in the external world or in our inner world, and ensures our interaction with this object, because if we lose the object, interaction with it is impossible. Once again, will and attention act from the level of a person's consciousness. But acting from the level of a person's consciousness, it can be that attention is not under his control. There is a phrase about this, to attract attention. And a whole branch of circus art is built on attracting attention, illusionism, in which much is based on the fact that a person's attention is attracted to one thing, and in the meantime something else is done outside of his attention. Therefore, loss of attention is one aspect of loss of self-mastery. The loss of will or the subordination of will, bypassing the control of one's own consciousness, either to the flow of circumstances, to egregorial algorithmics, or to another individual, is also a loss of self-mastery, which factually makes the individual a conductor of someone else's will, or a hostage of his own automatisms of behavior and egregorial algorithmics. We have finished 2 lectures dedicated to the personal psyche, its structure, saturation, typology. That's it for today. Thank you for your attention.